What's up, everyone? Welcome to Weekends. Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila with you. Nando, we've got a special show prepped for our audience today. You want to give them a little taste?
Yeah, it's been a year since our brother and comrade Michael Brooks passed away. And, I got to say, this was originally his show, his and your show. I still feel like a guest in someone else's home, in the best way possible. So we thought we would do a little remembrance. We're going to have on Lisha Brooks, Mike's sister, to talk about what she's up to with the Michael Brooks Legacy Project. We're going to have a couple guys in the Michael Brooks cinematic universe, Danny Bessner and Ben Burgis, to talk about, the wider world of foreign policy, what they're up to, the situation in Cuba. Ben just wrote a piece in Jacobin reacting to the latest round of protests. So, yeah, it's gonna be a good show.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to wrap the show today by sharing some of the videos that we really appreciated from Michael. It's a very foreign policy heavy show today, which I think makes a lot of sense while we honor Michael, because, in terms of left media in the US, no one does it better than Michael does or did when it comes to foreign policy related topics. So we're going to get into all of that a little later. But before we get to all of that, Nando, it's another year, another opportunity for Obama to share very important content with us in the form of his reading list, I guess, his recommended books, and also his mixtape. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? It always shocks me that people even care, but I guess they do. Who knows? I mean, there's a reason why they keep doing this, right? But I want to juxtapose that with something that Kale also brought to our attention. So let's get started. Let's talk about it. So there's a new New York Times graphic that details economic inequality in America. We know that economic inequality exists. Unfortunately, during the coronavirus pandemic, it was further exacerbated with the wealthiest individuals hoarding additional wealth, while poor people, of course, working people, had to bear the economic burdens and brunt of this pandemic. With that said, let's take a quick look at that graphic because it shows you a little of what's covered in this article. So scroll down. Okay, conventional wisdom. There we go. So you see that graphic, and it shows the share of net worth. By the start of 2021, the richest 1% of Americans held 32% of the nation's wealth. Sounds great. Its highest level since these records began in 1989. These interactive, graphics are a lot of fun.
Yeah.
The bottom 50%, meanwhile, held just 2% of the nation's wealth. This new record
game right there. That's the game right there, right?
Yep.
Like, that's everything. I mean, is there anything else even worth talking about? I mean, we fight about all this stuff, and that's the thing. I'll never forget when Comrade Obama, got up there and said that economic inequality was the defining issue of our time, as if he wasn't elected on a wave of discontent that was fueled by both our disastrous wars abroad, but more importantly, the economic meltdown caused by the 2008 financial crisis. Running on a platform of hope and change, this was going to change. We're going to change this. We're going to change this reality. And not only did he not change it, he probably supercharged it.
Yeah, I mean, and I want everyone to kind of keep this information, this data in mind as we talk about other topics throughout the show today, because, there's calls for regime change in Cuba, and we're going to get into that in more detail. And the whole argument by Cubans in South Florida especially is that, it's a failed economic system. Socialism is a failed economic system, and that's why Cubans are taking to the streets. I mean, you look at that graph, and are you going to argue that we don't have a failed economic system in place where during a global pandemic, the richest people continue to hoard the wealth, continue to get even richer, while working Americans lose more and more and more? I mean, the situation continues to devolve under a capitalistic model, right? And anyway, it's super frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea like of Cuba's failed economic model, and like no mention of like the other big country that's in the news. I did my decode on it last week. Is Haiti,
Yeah.
capitalist economy, total U.S. client state, or not U.S. client state, U.S. kind of under U.S. domination for decades. Poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, extreme levels of inequality, corruption, poverty, all the things you can attribute with that. And no one says it's a failure of their economics model.
No one. No. It's incredible. So
it's just that there's corruption, that's the only thing,
So you have Obama saying that, inequality is such an important issue that he apparently had no control over as the most powerful man in the world, not for 4 years, but for 8 years straight. But let's just forget about all of that. And let's focus on what Obama is reading and what kind of music he's listening to. These lists come out ever so often. I don't know if it's every year. I usually ignore it because I don't care. But why don't we talk a little bit about what books he's recommending? So there we go. Barack Obama's summer reading list. This was posted on his Instagram page. At night, all blood is black.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read any of these books, Nando?
No. I have not read any of them. I know that Obama hasn't read them either. I mean, that's my big thing with especially Obama's reading lists, because they're always so long. Like I'll never forget. I got in a fight with a couple people at the place that I was working at because I tweeted out in 2019 that because Obama tweeted out like a list of all the books he'd read, including one called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, I think. And it's like this huge, dense book that there's just like a 0% chance that he sat down and read, because he's Obama, he's got busy doing other stuff. He's just like the amount of books that were on his list, and not like all the books he's read in the year, just his favorite ones, implying that there was many more that he read, which did not make the list. There was something like 30 books on there. And I just I know Obama is not reading 3 books a month. Like, I know he's not reading a book a week. Like, this is his staff, curating a list.
Yes, that's
in a perfect way that kind of is both ideologically kind of samples a little bit from this side, a little bit from that side, shows that he's like not beholden to any one thing, but is also crucially gender perfect, and that it's like it's not like all white men or anything like that. Like he needs like an appropriate kind of panoply of different races and genders to ensure that there's like a certain amount of inclusivity. Like I guarantee you, they're like, oh, this year's reading list, Obama, you got too many white men on it. You gotta dump these 2 and put some other 2 because how is that gonna look? Like it's just so obvious that this is all fake. That this is just all fake. That this is just not really what he reads or liked. That it's just a produced, manufactured thing to make him seem like he's the kind of guy that liberals want to believe he is. This kind of, media savvy, urbane guy who reads the same thing that they do, but slightly at a higher level, slightly more difficult books than they read, but like kind of in the same world, watches the same TV shows that you watch, engages with the
just
same
like
media.
Us.
Just like us, because that's all we got in politics, baby. It's all just media. And not just that, but it's just so infantilizing. Like the media culture that we have is so infantilizing these days, in which everything has to be like perfectly on the nose. Like this person is good, that person is bad, and he is participating that and regurgitating it back to us in such a obviously cynical way, and people just lap it up. They lap it up. They love it. The liberals, they love it, and it just drives me crazy.
But so when you say the liberals, because I got to be honest with you, do ordinary people, even those who self-identify as liberals, care at all? Because, I mean, I'm obviously speaking from my own personal bias here. I don't identify as a liberal, but nonetheless, like, I don't care, right? Like, these lists come out and I just kind of like, I don't even look at it ever, with the exception of this show, because we're talking about it right now. Like, who cares? Ordinary people don't care.
I mean, I wouldn't say like ordinary people, but people that are very invested in kind of the Democratic Party, the kind of people that have like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg poster on their wall or whatever, like those people care about that stuff. They really do.
It's amazing.
And Obama is very good at managing his image and celebrity. And if it didn't matter and nobody cared, he wouldn't do it, because he is pretty savvy in that sense. Like, he understands the audience that he's playing to. You're not that audience. Like, you're not that person. But the kind of person who like loves MSNBC and like subscribes to the New York Times because like that's like, fighting against fascism. That's how you do it. You subscribe to the New York Times. Like that kind of person like loves that shit. They love it. They love it. They love it. And you see people like on Twitter, like, the kind of liberal partisan, consent manufacturers debating Obama's reading list in a kind of serious way, like as if they were like, oh, look, he's, like he's read this. That means he's grappling with so-and-so's ideas about whatever the fuck. And I'm like, you're an idiot. You're like, maybe a staffer read it and just gave him like a 2-paragraph synopsis in case anyone asked him about it at a party, and he could just like say the 2 things that kind of indicated that he read it, but it's just such obvious bullshit. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, don't worry. He also released a list of songs that he likes in his playlist. So I might be more familiar with some of the stuff.
Yeah.
No, not. I know Desperado. Okay, got that.
Yeah, Migos, Rihanna. The Rolling Stones. Again, see, he like is the perfect. It's just like the perfect, Miles Davis. Bob Marley and the Wailers. Ooh, like it's just the perfect mix of like. I'm signaling that I'm still kind of young and with it, but I'm also like a boomer and I like my boomer stuff. I also like Erykah Badu, like I still listen to I don't know. It's all just so obviously perfectly manufactured and curated. Like I'm, thinking about Mike, I'm just like trying to imagine like, doing like parodying Obama's summer playlist and like what it would be like Nation of Islam Obama's like summer playlist and reading list. And, like,
totally.
Like, what would it be like? I was on NWA. Fuck the police. I don't agree with defund the police, but
Oh my God, it's so true. By the way, there is a reading list with I think about 100 books that Matt Leck and David Griscom and I believe Lisha, his sister, released after he passed away. Highly recommend checking out the books in that list. Of course, he was on point and he actually did read those books and would vouch for them. And so to wrap up this story or this segment, why don't we share a book that's had a lot of influence on us, right? Politically speaking, or a book that, we think is worth reading. There's so many, obviously, with politics, there's so many different angles to cover. Shock Doctrine, I think, is a essential read for everyone, especially right now in understanding why it's so disastrous for the United States to intervene militarily or anyway, like in attempting to like topple a regime. Anyway, so there's that. But I would say for me, like the book that I think about a lot lately is Bright-Sided. And I know I've plugged that book a lot on this show, but Bright-Sided by Barbara Ehrenreich. Yeah. It's just such an important book in understanding the culture around us, right? The corporate culture, but more importantly, like this culture of like faux positivity and how it's meant to like make you submissive to this system that's screwing you, And Barbara, come on the show. I want to interview you so badly. I would love it. But please read Bright-Sided. It's one of my favorite books.
I recommend to everyone that they read Eric Hobsbawm's kind of history of the, starting from the essentially the French Revolution through the end of the Cold War, especially the final one, which is called Age of Extremes. I believe it's called like the Age of Extremes, a history of the short 20th, what he calls the short 20th century. In Hobsbawm's view, like the 20th century starts with the Russian Revolution and ends with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And it's just a history of the world during that period, like all of it. He takes like it's a tour to, all over the world. Kind of goes through the end of the First World War and the Second World War, but like just a history of all of it, and it's just so breathtakingly coherent like his command of just all of it is incredible, and he's just a very fun writer. Like he had a very good writing style. Like he had this kind of like just such a way, like these clever turns of phrases. I don't know. Like if you want to just like understand history, you have to read like one book. Not like specifically about American history. Like, I mean, with American history, I always recommend the Robert Caro books.
Yes.
You've read them, but
Huge fan.
they were great. I mean, they're addicting. You like just can't stop reading them. But the Hobsbawm books, I really recommend, especially the last one, Age of Extremes. I mean, he has the Age of Revolution, which is like, French Revolution and the the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. The Age of Capital, which is when like capitalism really kind of took hold in Europe and in America and imposed itself. And then the Age of Empire, which was when Europe kind of took over the rest of the world. And then or Britain and capitalism really took over the rest of the world. And then the Age of Extremes, which is the 20th century, which is just the most remarkable century, you can. So yeah, Eric Hobsbawm's books, I recommend a lot.
I'm just to jump in. This is like super nerdy, but Age of Revolution is actually my anticipated book read next week. So
you haven't read it
on the beach? No, I haven't. I've been meaning to read Hobsbawm. I mean, I've read a couple.
Have you read any of those other ones?
No, none on the series. I've read some of his other work. So like Nations and Nationalism is one of the most incredible books I've ever read. So I'll throw that one in. Another Hobsbawm.
He's like a good, like he's a good writer. Like, I mean, apart from being a good historian,
he's like
Kale. This is maybe we can read that book together. Like we've been talking about doing like a book club type situation, but we haven't really like settled on a book. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is what we do.
Do some Hobsbawm. That would rule. Yeah, we should. I mean, we should just do a Jacobin book club. I mean, we should do it, but then you, the audience, should also read it.
Yeah,
so you read it and then let us know what you think, and somehow we'll all morph into one eventually. I wanted to just, before we go on to the next thing, I did want to go back to that New York Times graph one more time, actually, just because there's one more thing at the end that I think is really worth looking at, which is that that since the start of 2020, the bottom 50% of the population gained $700 billion in wealth, which, cool, that's great. But
nothing compared to the wealthy.
Yeah, the richest 1% gained 10 trillion. So
10 trillion. Come on down. Congratulations. You did it.
Yeah.
That's
we're back in the age of capital. So anyways.
Markets are rational. I mean, the markets have decided that all that wealth should float all the way to the top. That's just the way it works. Much better system than what you see in other countries like Cuba, Anyway,
yeah. So read Obama's fiction. That's how you should handle it. I was surprised that in Obama's podcast list he included Cumtown. I'm glad he was looking out for the Cumtown fans.
Get out
That's
of here.
Not real. That's not real. All right,
get out of here. Get the hell out of here. Let's get the hell out of here. With the bad jokes. Yeah. I listen to Job on Clubhouse because I want to hear the other side. That's what I do.
All right, Nando. Well, one place where people can get books is over at the Verso Book Club. So why don't you tell our audience a little about that?
Yes, ditch Obama's reading list and join the Verso reading list. Because if you join the Verso Book Club, you get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as one or more books in the mail. All Verso Book Club members will also get 50% off everything on the website, including the Verso Conrad tote bag, for as long as you are a subscriber. Each member tier is 50% off for your first 3 months. The Conrad tier is only $20 a month. And if you join in July, you'll get these 4 books: One Way Street and Other Writings by Walter Benjamin, Feminist Anti-Fascism, Counterpublics of the Common by Eva Majewska, The Great Adaptation, Climate, Capitalism, and Catastrophe by Romain Feli, and The Tragedy of the Worker, Towards the Proletariat by Jamie Allinson, China Mieville, Richard Seymour, friend of the show, and Rosie Warren.
Very nice. Very nice. Everyone check out Verso and check out the interview we're about to do with our good friend, Ben Burgis, host of Give Them an Argument. He's about to give us an argument about the situation in Cuba. Ben, how are you?
I am really good, Anna. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks for joining us, especially to discuss an important topic that you wrote about in Jacobin. There's a protest currently going down in Cuba. The piece that we're referring to is titled "The U.S. Must End Its Brutal Sanctions Against Cuba, Not Intervene There." And I appreciated your piece. In fact, I read a few excerpts of it from on the Young Turks today, because I think you made really great arguments about Haiti. So before we get into that, though, why don't you give us just a quick, I guess, summary of what your main argument is here?
Yeah, and this is, I should say, by the way, this is really inappropriate because we're about to talk about something that's serious and important. For the last couple of minutes, all I've been able to think about is the Obama podcast list where he includes Cumtown. Like the, like you could, like the same principle that
I wouldn't want Sasha and Malia to listen to it, but they're a riot.
He's going to talk about like current music to show that he's hip, but he'll also include Tumbling Dice from Exile on Main Street. Say, look, I mean, I listen to Pod Save America, but sometimes you just want to hear about being gay with your dad. So it's
my God.
But I will say, in all seriousness, one thing that Obama did that is good, which is not to say way off and start sentences, is that he did try to open up diplomatically to Cuba just a little bit towards the end of his second term. He actually went to Cuba and did some things that he could do unilaterally to loosen up restrictions on what U.S. citizens could do in Cuba. A lot of it he couldn't do without congressional authorization. And then Donald Trump reversed all of that. Trump, who, some very gullible people thought was going to, be anti-imperialist in some sort of weird right-wing isolationist way, was, of course, the exact opposite of that. He was much more hawkish than the previous administration in almost every category, and definitely including Cuba. And he tightened up restrictions a lot when he came to office. And Biden, unfortunately, since coming to office, hasn't loosened them back up again. He's made no effort to go back to that diplomatic opening to Cuba that happened under Obama. And the combination of this, what already is a very unnatural situation, that Cuba has been under some level or another of trade embargo with this giant piece of the world economy that's represented by the United States, and obviously Cuba's now largest natural trading partner since the Kennedy administration. But you place on top of that this worldwide pandemic that shut down their tourism industry, which is a huge part of the Cuban economy. And that was shut down for a year. I mean, they've only just started to reopen it, very recently. And the combination of those things has been absolutely brutal. And so Cubans have been experiencing lots of shortages, more than usual, of, food, medicine. They've been trying really hard to get people the COVID vaccine, but that also means there are trade-offs there, and there are other kinds of medicine that they can't import. And power, there have been power outages, and all of these shortages have sparked a lot of frustration and by Cuban standards, at least, big street protests. Not as big as have happened in other countries in Latin America, which is a point we should make, because 2 days of protests in Cuba get massive international news coverage, and months of protests in some other Latin American countries get a tiny fraction of that. But by Cuban standards, very big protests. And this, in turn, has led some politicians, like the mayor of Miami, for example,
one of my favorite guys. Just like
he's awful, awful, absolutely awful. In fact,
he's exactly what my city deserves.
So we've got video of him talking about the protests in Cuba, but more importantly, what he believes needs to be done in response to the Cuban government. So we have two clips. The first addresses the sanctions that you referred to, Ben. Let's watch that, and I want to get a response from you.
Let's do it.
Ben Rhodes, who, of course, was national security advisor to President Obama, tweeted this: the Cuban people suffer doubly from a repressive government and a cruel U.S. embargo. They deserve policies that empower them and help them improve their lives. Do you think that President Biden, looking at this situation, will lift that embargo? And do you think that's what he should do?
No, I don't think the embargo is cruel at all. And I think that the Cuban people are not asking for a lifting of the embargo. They're going out on the streets every single day talking about the failure of the communist regime to provide for its people.
His Miami accent is just so thick. It's crazy. They're like going out on the streets talking about the communist regime, okay? Not the sanctions, bro. Like, it's not like what they're talking about.
Yeah, one thing that Nando and I have in common is we both used to live in Miami, and I think we probably both knew a lot of guys who sounded just like that. But yeah, I mean, this is incredibly disingenuous, and there's a really easy way that you can tell that it's incredibly disingenuous, which is that, like, what we just saw, pick, right? It can't be both. Either it's really important to keep the embargo in place as a pressure tactic to get this horrible, evil, tyrannical regime to change its ways, or the embargo is just an excuse and really all of the shortages are just a result of flaws in Cuba's economic systems, because both of those can't be true. If it's not having a big effect on the Cuban economy, what's the point of the embargo?
Yeah.
And can I just go ahead, Nando? Sorry, I just wanted to elaborate a little more on the sanctions, because there is a common talking point among supporters of basically toppling the government in Cuba. And they argue that, like, the sanctions are not that big of a deal because it just prevents trade and travel between Cuba and the United States. That is not true.
It does way more than that.
It does way more than that. And the embargo and the sanctions were bad prior to Obama lifting a few of them, like loosening up the embargo. However, Trump not only re-implemented those sanctions, but he tightened those sanctions even further. So Cuba is considered a state sponsor of terrorism as a result of what Trump did. And so what does that do? It prevents international banks from doing business or financing the Cuban government in any way, because they're worried about retaliation from the United States. Think about it. If you're a bank and you're thinking about doing business with Cuba, but the United States, a hegemon, refers to Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, you're probably going to be a little scared to do business with Cuba, right? So it really has hurt them economically. And what further compounded it was the coronavirus pandemic and how it basically did away with one of the main sources of revenue for the country, which is, of course, tourism. So Cuba's in a terrible place. The United States certainly has a big role in that. And, to pretend as though the sanctions are not a big deal, I think is ridiculous. But I think lifting the sanctions is the only thing the U.S. government can and should do. But anyways.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I was going to say, there's this talking point that you hear a lot that says, but they could trade with Canada, they could trade with Europe. So, like, what's the big deal, about the United States? First of all, that means that anything that's produced in the United States, which is like a massive amount of what exists in the world economy, you can't get in Cuba. Then that state sponsor of terrorism designation, which, by the way, like, if you look at the official justification for putting Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which is something the Trump administration did like at the last minute. I mean, that was something that kind of did in between filing nuisance lawsuits to try to overturn the election. And the stated justification for that was basically that, Cuba and Colombia and, other countries, but I think Colombia primarily, don't have extradition treaties. There are people who are accused of things in Colombia who are in Cuba and can't be extradited back. But I mean, just not having an extradition treaty cannot possibly be good enough to make you a state sponsor of terrorism. And if it did, then the United States, I mean, how many people who've committed bombings and assassinations and hijackings in Cuba have lived openly in Miami since then? I mean, that would more than cut both ways.
What they say is that like Cuban spies are all over Latin America. Like they make the Cuban spy apparatus out to be like, you know, these like James Bond level guys who are all over Latin America working with like the Venezuelans and stuff like that to like undermine everything. I mean, that's like what they say. But what I found remarkable about this round of protests is that, like, contrary to other flare-ups in Cuba, is that a lot of the you know, more hardline Cuban elements are kind of saying the quiet part out loud that they didn't always used to say. I mean, there's always like the most insane people that would say, like, you know, nuke 'em. But like the mayor of Miami kind of went there in a way that others don't, that others didn't in the past, because, like, you know, obviously, like, the question is like, okay, say it's, you're right, they're awful. The Castros are the worst. They're the worst people. What do we do about it, huh? We already do the sanctions. What do we do about it? Let's hear it from Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, let's hear it.
And what should be being contemplated right now is a coalition of potential military action in Cuba, similar to what has happened in both administrations, in both Republican and Democrat administrations. In Republican with Bush in Panama, they deposed Noriega, and that country had peaceful democracy for decades. And you had interventions by Democratic presidents, you know, taking out Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's a sovereign country where they took out a terrorist that probably saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and President Clinton in Kosovo, intervening in a humanitarian issue with airstrikes. So there have been many opportunities in the history.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table.
Jesus.
Insane.
It's a military coalition, all right, bro? Like, you do like a coalition of military stuff, okay, bro? And then you bomb them, and then you get them out of there, bro. We've done it before. We did it in Iraq. We did it in all over the place, bro, and it was fine, okay? Like, why didn't anyone complain then?
Yeah, so I mean, I do want to say, like, I don't think we should assume, like, some people, lots of people in the United States have like the typical sort of Americans watching international news disease, which is that they watch 90 seconds of news footage and then they have like a complete read on the situation and who's right and who's wrong, and all of that stuff. And there's obviously lots of that going on the right, you know, crazy right-wing anti-communist Cubans in Miami who are sure that anybody who's in the street must agree with them about everything, you know, and I think you also get some of it on the left, that, you know, that I think some people are a little bit too quick to assume that everybody who's frustrated by shortages, who might have one complaint or another about the government, might be protesting, is like a CIA agent or something, right? Like, I don't think we should do that. I'm sure, like, I think it's way too early to know anything really about the politics of different people protests. I'm sure there's lots of different factions, lots of different agendas. And also, like, that's, you know, what happens in Cuba should be for the Cubans to figure out. The United States doesn't need
exactly
to have a vote, you know.
Exactly. And who are we? Who are we, by the way? And who's the Miami mayor to say what the governing situation should be in Cuba? Bro, like, with language you can maybe understand. You just had a building in Miami collapse. You have other buildings in Miami where people are literally evacuating because they're poorly built and about to collapse. I mean, really, do we have any place right now to tell the Cuban people what's best for them, as we're experiencing like record inequality in the country? We're watching our infrastructure fall apart. Like, we're not really a good example of an economic system that works. So for us to say, like, we should topple this government and destabilize this country is disgusting and ridiculous.
Also notice that when he's talking about, like, U.S. intervention, his Latin America example, he has to go back to 1989 to Panama, because he's certainly not going to bring up the 2004 intervention when U.S. Marines kidnapped the president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and took him out of the country to impose a new one, because obviously Haiti is undergone like continuously like dystopian levels of poverty and economic inequality and instability. The president of Haiti was just assassinated. This clearly did not lead to any sort of stable democracy in Haiti. He's certainly not going to bring up Honduras, where there was a U.S.-backed coup in 2009. He's not going to bring up
Libya.
Libya.
He's not going to bring up Libya. But the thing is that what I was texting with a journalist named David Quinones out of Miami. He hosts something called the Bird Road podcast, which is like a Miami centric podcast, and he was pointing out that, like, there are protests on the street. There is probably a lot of genuine discontent. There is probably also, like, astroturfing and Twitter bots and all that stuff, like, which has happened in Brazil, which has happened in Mexico, which has happened in Bolivia, which has happened everywhere. It's like super proven and documented. Plus, the United States in Cuba has a huge record of this kind of thing, like creating their own version of Twitter and things like that, like a CIA Twitter in Cuba. But there is probably some genuine discontent. But there is also massive counter protests, much like would occur here in the United States. Like when there was like a Tea Party protest, and then there's like some other group of protesters who are like against the Tea Party protesters. And like, so there's a massive counter protest kind of supporting the government. And the picture that everyone is using, and that was in that Fox News clip of the people climbing up the statue, is actually an image of the counter protest. There's a guy holding up the 26 de Julio movement flag, the red and black flag, which was like the vanguard of faction of Fidel Castro, from like the guys who came down from the mountains. That was a counter protest to the protests which are being covered, and it's just being treated as.
Of course, because it's like this. It's people have this like black and white like cartoon in their heads of like Cubans want freedom and they like they want to restore what we all saw in Godfather 2 to Cuba. But of course, like, Cuba is a complex society, like any other society, that you have like different political factions. You absolutely have like super right-wing elements of the Catholic Church, and people who are aligned with Miami exiles, and people who really are connected to the CIA. And you have people who, you have a huge popular base of support that's still loyal to the government. You have people who maybe like Castro but aren't crazy about the current guy, or basically want to maintain the system they have now in Cuba but want some reforms. It's going to be a whole spectrum like you'd have anywhere. But the overwhelming point I think that we need to make is just a really simple one, which is that the United States shouldn't get to decide who wins. What
the immediate thing that has to happen is to end the United States' basically war on Cuba that has been going on for decades, and like then we'll see what happens. Like then we can debate about the government or whatever, but like any presupposition like has to be that to end any American intervention in Cuba, which it's not like it is happening right now. Like it's been happening for decades. Like that is the first step that has to happen before anything can be even remotely discussed about the merits of this government or its faults or its because it's crazy that's not the thing.
No, absolutely. I mean, like this is the thing. Like people will say, oh, but if we end the embargo, then what's the incentive Cuba to change whatever? What changes or doesn't change in Cuba should have nothing to do with us. Right? This should be entirely for Cubans to decide what the future of their country is like. There's absolutely no reason the United States should get to influence that. And the other thing, like the crucial point is that if you want to help, like the thing that immediately sparked these protests were the shortages. Like everybody agrees on that. Whatever else is true, like that was like the immediate spark. And if you want to do something to alleviate the shortages, there's exactly one thing that the United States can do. And it's exactly the opposite of what the mayor of Miami is talking about. It's exactly the opposite of what Val Demings, who's a Democratic congresswoman from Florida, is talking about. Yes, says the White House must move swiftly. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. That the United States, the White House should be doing something to guarantee "quote unquote" freedom in Cuba. And we can look at all of the countries where, I mean, we just listed off a bunch of Latin American countries where there were U.S.-backed coups, but like what the mayor of Miami is talking about is more than that. It's airstrikes. It's maybe even invasion like Panama. And look at the recent track record of that. I mean, we're in the 20th year of the forever war in Afghanistan. The ripple effects of the invasion of Iraq are still leading to like waves of bloodshed and chaos in the Middle East. Libya was turned into a failed state by U.S. airstrikes and proxies overthrowing the government there. Like the track record of this makes it just amazing that anybody thinks that Cuba would be this like stable, prosperous democracy if the U.S. got its way. But again, like whether Cuba keeps its current system or has different systems should not be up to the United States. But if we want to do something to help the shortages that have immediately sparked the protest, just lift the embargo. And it's ridiculous. People pretending, this embargo, that's just an excuse. That really doesn't make a big difference, because the whole point of having an embargo is to bring about this exact thing. And that's explicit. I mean, you can go back and look at like even before Kennedy actually signed this in, when Eisenhower was initially considering imposing sanctions on Cuba. There's a quote from Eisenhower's in The Guardian today where he said, well, if the people are hungry, they'll throw out Castro. I mean, that was the explicit reasoning for doing this in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. And one other, go ahead, Nando.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to mention the recent change in leadership in Cuba, because I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating, so I want to be clear about that. But, some of my concern is that Cuba is in a particularly vulnerable position because of this new president who was not part of the Cuban Revolution, of the Cubans who are very supportive of the communist government. They have a lot of respect and admiration for the Castros because of what they did in pushing for this revolution that wasn't a result of like the Soviet Union coming in and making it happen, right? It was a popular movement. And now you have this new leadership, and I'm wondering if there's like, and obviously we're speculating, but if there's like this maybe air of distrust toward him. I don't know. I mean, I worry that that's also part of the equation, and that some bad actors, internationally speaking, are going to use it to their advantage to try to topple the government.
No, I think that's right. Like, I think that Fidel Castro had tremendous personal popularity. Raul probably a little less so, and the current guy a lot less because he's not connected to that. But like in terms of what, just to go back one more time to that lunatic mayor, what he's talking about, doing airstrikes and, some sort of military, the military coalition to topple the Cuban government. Like the fact that Cuba's system was not imposed by Soviet troops like Eastern Europe, that it came about as a result of a popular revolution, is really important to emphasize. Because realistically, what that means is, as bad as some of these other interventions have been by the United States, if like Biden was insane enough to listen to this advice from the mayor of Miami, from Val Demings, from other people, like that would be 1,000 times worse than some of these other interventions. Like that would be like the war in Vietnam, because if the United States was actually going to militarily intervene to try to topple a country that was brought about by a popular revolution that still has a huge base of support, like, what do you think all the like communists in Cuba are going to do, right? If the United States empire comes in there and tries to get rid of their system by force, I mean, do you think that this like whatever percentage of the population you think it is, it's still a big one, right? Do you think that Cuban communists would take that lying down, or do you think that they'd like take up arms and do what they did to take power in the first place? And then that could be like, I mean, like that could really be bad on the level of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia in the 70s.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's all the same thing that was going on when Venezuela was in, going through tremendous economic hardships, and there were, protests on the street because there were massive shortages, because the price of oil collapsed, and a million other reasons. Also mismanagement from the Maduro government, a million other reasons. And it's like you saw like the new kind of the young bucks on the scene in Miami are the Venezuelan diaspora, or exile community as they call themselves. And it's like, well, what do you I'm like, well, what are you going to do about it? And like they often advocate like military intervention. They don't, they would never ever like lift up the economic sanctions. Like if you want to help those people in Venezuela, like the first thing you do is lift the economic sanctions. Like if there's shortages, lift the sanctions, bro. Like that's the first thing that's what's gonna help these people. Because you don't like the guy.
But that's never considered. Like no. It's always the way. I mean, we're going to talk to Danny Bessner later, and this is a very Bessner-esque point. But I mean, like the way that we always talk about helping people who are experiencing some sort of civil war or economic crisis or whatever in other countries, it's always framed as either we, help them by bombing them, or we just don't do anything, right? Like, yeah. And there are usually lots of things that the United States, as a rich and powerful country, could do that aren't those two things. I mean, we could. In a case like Cuba or Venezuela, yeah, just stop intervening there to try to strangle the economies of those countries. That would be huge. In other cases, we can take in refugees. That's doing something. We can send like food and medical aid. That's doing something. Which way would be the least we can do in the Cuba case, because they constantly send medical aid all around the world.
Yes, exactly. And I guess the final thing I'll say about this is, so our good friend, Professor Wolf, does really great segments about, just updates on what's happening internationally. And one of his podcast episodes that I really enjoyed was about how Cuba was actually opening up its economy, not to multinational corporations. That would be a bad thing, but opening up the ability for workers to own the companies they work for, right? So worker co-ops, and that's like exciting stuff. And I mention that because my feeling is the Cuban diaspora is much less concerned about the well-being of Cuban citizens and just far more interested in toppling that government because of their unending bitterness and grudge over what happened in the 1950s. Like, I just think if you do care about the well-being of the Cuban people, then yeah, you'd listen to what their concerns are right now regarding the shortages, and you would help to alleviate that. But they don't want to do that. They want to keep the sanctions in place. They want to crush the Cuban people to the point where they're so desperate that there's an uprising and they topple the government. That's the whole point of the sanctions. And the United States has no business intervening in any way, certainly not militarily or with these kinds of sanctions. They should be lifted. That's the only role the U.S. should play. And by the way, Biden campaigned on that. Biden, who had all these negative things to say about Trump, decided to continue with many of Trump's disastrous, broken foreign policies.
And Florida.
Yeah, who cares? They're not going to vote for you, Biden.
They lost Florida anyway.
Venezuelans.
But that's the calculus.
Exactly.
That's these, like they're like, we lost Florida because of that, and so that's the calculus. I mean, it's that.
Which is so intensely frustrating because, like, back in early 2020, that it's like, man, that was just last year, right? Okay, yes, back in early 2020. Tried to make it this big thing. It's like, Bernie Sanders has been winning everything, but he can't be the nominee because look at him making these statements where he'd say like two critical things about Cuba and also like praise their legitimate accomplishments. That Bernie denies that Cuba is a completely evil country with no redeeming features, and we can't have that because then the Democrats would lose Florida. And that was like one of the big anti-Bernie arguments at one point. And then we got Biden instead. We lost Florida anyway. It didn't matter.
Yeah. And Obama won Florida 2 times, despite, his kind of literally the exact same comments he made. And then the other thing with the embargo that I think is always, always, always worth pointing out, and you pointed it out in your piece, and I appreciated it because it's just, because in America the embargo is like we're like fish in water. We don't know it. It's just like that's all we know. But like to the rest of the world, the embargo is a horrific act. And the United States is completely isolated on the world stage. I mean, they had a UN vote where like literally every single country in the world, except for the United States and Israel, and the abstentions of like, you know, the most insane right-wing governments.
Yeah, literally, the United
Yeah.
States and Israel were the only no votes, and the three abstentions were Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil, and
Duque.
Colombia.
Yeah.
And the Ukraine. I know they don't like
In
the
Ukraine,
definite article.
Yeah.
They should have been nicer to my family if they, wanted me to leave out the definite article.
Right.
But yeah, like countries that are as dependent on the goodwill of the United States as Brazil and Ukraine and Colombia, we're still only abstentions. We literally only get Benjamin Netanyahu at that point to Israel, to be the only other country that was willing to join us and actually voting no. 184 countries voted yes. Of course, the United States should lift this terrible embargo, and of course we should. It's a no-brainer. I mean, if you take out like pandering to Miami Cubans, if you take out like insane Cold War grudges and fear of setting a good example for other countries in Latin America that might have been tempted to have their own revolutions, if you take those out of the equation, there's no way to justify having an embargo on Cuba. That it's like, oh, what we China has most favored nation, trading status, and Saudi Arabia, is a massive economic partner to the United States, but Cuba's human rights situation is just too unacceptable.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And I mean, it's not like the United States has any problems with human rights issues. Like, I don't know, federal agents taking protesters off the street and putting them into like unmarked vans. Like, no issues here.
The highest incarceration rate in the world.
Exactly.
You're more likely, I mean, I don't think, I don't want to, romanticize Cuba. I think they've accomplished like real things and that are like incredibly impressive. I think it's kind of a miracle that it exists, given what they're dealing with. But there are things that are legitimate flaws in Cuba and its system, and sure, all true, right? But the idea that I mean, for like bottom line, if you're a poor Cuban, you're much less likely to end up in prison than if you're a poor American. And never mind like some of the like truly monstrous countries that the United States has absolutely no problem trading with, selling guns to, supporting and propping up in 100 ways.
So Ben, before we let you go, we have one final question for you since, we have a Michael theme throughout the show. It's been 1 year since he's passed away. And for me, his foreign policy was the best. I mean, he helped really break things down in a nuanced way without, whitewashing some of the human rights abuses, but also making a robust case for why U.S. intervention is a terrible idea. What inspired you? Like, what kind of content from Michael did you appreciate the most?
Yeah, I mean, that was always a huge part of it. I mean, I think back to when I first started listening to the show, which was actually even slightly before I met him. I don't think I became a Patreon until like the day I met him, but I'd listened to a few episodes of the show before that because my friend Mark Warren had turned me on to it. And before I'd often had a really weird relationship with leftist podcasts that I would one would start and I would get excited about it and I would like listen to a few episodes and then I realized that it started to feel like homework and I would stop, and there were things that are somewhat comedy podcasts that I'd listen to if that's all you listen to, it's like starts to feel like eating just eating cotton candy at a certain point. And TMBS had like a really unique balance to it because both like it was just hitting it out of the park on both ends. That on the one hand, you had this like graduate seminar level of nuance and depth, especially to, the internationalist foreign policy coverage, but also, he's talking about domestic issues. And on the other hand, I mean, it was like funnier than most things that are just comedy podcasts. I mean, like that there were, as both of you guys know, I mean, even in person, just like casual conversation, Michael was like much funnier, than most people whose entire job is to be funny. And so that was like, yeah, I mean, the have the Nation of Islam, Obama, and all of that stuff, and it would just like, you would damn near be pissing yourself laughing listening to that. Then like the next minute, he'd be, interviewing Adolph Reed and, and talking about this like sort of deep critique of like the way identity politics, the way class politics, or the next minute, he'd be doing these like really deep dive foreign policy segments. And I will say, I guess just one, I get maybe just two specific things. Like one, since we've been talking about Cuba, I mean, that was something he was like, that was the subject he was really passionate about. And like we talked about a lot, and he had a kind of streak, like when it came to like liberation movements in the global South, he
Mm-hmm.
had I mean, he was very emotionally connected to that, that really meant something to him, whether it was the Cuban Revolution, the ANC and struggle against apartheid, or any that really meant something to him on a visceral level, and to the point that like sometimes like we'd be like planning a segment or something, he'd be like, "Okay, Ben, I agree with you, but like, leave out the nuance. Like, just say like, they're like, this is a heroic country that's doing amazing things, the embargo, because like that's the point that we need to emphasize." And I'll also say like
he always recommended the autobiography of Fidel Castro.
Yeah, he did.
That was a great read. He's like, I read that for inspiration sometimes.
yeah, it's very Michael comment. And yeah, even his sort of jokes, having like a little bit of fun with the like absurdities of the American left, he would like tie it back into that, right? I remember like a line he used a few times to be in conversation, and then I think like once eventually he did on air, was like, if the problem with the American left is like if we ever had to go up to the mountains like Castro's guerrillas, so like we couldn't do it because people would say it was ableist, to go into the mountains.
They didn't have an ADA ramp,
And he said, and I'll also say like on the Latin America, like staying on the Latin America stuff, he was like. When I first started listening to TMBS, there was a point where it was like, oh my God, we're going to do another deep dive on Brazil. Like I've heard like 10 of these things. It's like, I just want to get back to the other, the other content. Like I don't know how much.
Yeah, bash some Warren, like give me some Warren bashing.
Yeah, exactly. But then like I listened to so much. Then I listened to so much of it that like it actually got me. It like got to me, and then like I started to get obsessed with it too, and like to the point where like the first article I ever wrote for Jacobin was actually about Lula and the and the situation in Brazil, and it was really and again that's something that just was viscerally important to him. I mean, I remember one of the last times, not quite the last time, but like the next to last time that I spent a weekend with him, like crashing on his couch in Brooklyn. He was getting ready to fly down to Brazil to interview him, and he was just like so excited about that. I mean, it was like vibrating. It's like he was so psyched about that. And then like the last time I ever stayed with him, the weekend of of that last TMBS live show just before the pandemic, like he had, you were talking about how much he read earlier. which is totally true. I mean, which is funny because he would always make like these little comments, like these like kind of self-deprecating comments, like, yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who like dunks on people on podcasts, like when he's talking to people who, like the real experts or whatever. But then like every time I was ever in that apartment, there was always some like incredibly heavy reading that he was halfway through, that you could see that he left out. And yeah, last time I was staying with him, he had in like a place of honor, that now iconic picture of him, with Lula, like on the bookshelf, in his apartment. So, I mean, it sucks beyond words that, that we lost him, at 36 years old, and that like the decades that, should have had, that, that we were all expecting to have with him, didn't happen. It's incredibly unfair, but the, I mean, that is, and it's really awful that like his last months were, the pandemic and staying inside and all of that. But I am really, really happy that like he got to go down to Brazil, just before all of that. And, and he kind of had this streak, where he got to interview a lot of his heroes, and he got to like meet and, and interview Cornel West. And, that's I mean, it doesn't make it that much better, but, I am really happy about that.
Yeah. Ben, thank you so much for being part of the show today and being generous with your time. It was really great to have you. So everyone go check out Ben's work, not only on Jacobin, where he just published this piece, "The U.S. must end its brutal sanctions against Cuba, not intervene there," but also check out his podcast, Give Them an Argument. I actually really appreciated your conversation about Cuba on your own podcast. So everyone go check that out as well. Thanks again, Ben.
All right. Thanks so much, Hannah.
All right.
All right.
Well, are we ready for our next guest?
We're ready, baby.
All right, let's do it. Joining us now is Danny Bessner, a historian, good friend of the show, and someone who just launched a new podcast, which I'm super excited about. Just listen to your first episode of American Prestige. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm also ready for you guys, so we're all on the same page here.
Nice. All right. Well, Nando, why don't you ask the first question? Go ahead.
Sure. Why is it called American Prestige?
Well, a genius came up with the idea actually in conversation with me. It was actually Nando's recommendation, but the reason that it stuck out to us is that it's something that people regularly say in the foreign policy community. People regularly talk about American prestige, and to Derek and myself, it really highlighted kind of the absurdities at the center of the U.S. imperial project, that the United States would do what it does for prestige and for American prestige. And so it's, a little bit of a winking title, a little bit of an ironic title, and of course the fact that not necessarily people will not necessarily think that Derek and myself are the most prestigious of commentators until they listen to us. But it's working on a lot of different levels here, on the top, middle, and the bottom.
Well, what I love is that you guys are tackling U.S. foreign policy in a nuanced way, because I think, I don't know, without getting into specifics, I have issues with the way some people on the left cover foreign policy, and more importantly, what goes down internationally in various countries. I think that there tends to be a black and white view of things, which ends up discrediting the left in the way that they engage in these conversations. So the nuance is really, really important. So why don't we start off with your thoughts regarding the Biden administration so far, with, what he's done foreign policy wise?
Sure. And that's one of the things, Anna, that we're going to try to do with the podcast, which it's difficult to really feel foreign policy in the same way one can feel economic policy or social policy, or certainly something like healthcare policy or welfare policy. And so what we're going to try to do is try to relate these issues to what is actually going on in people's lives. It's one of the things that we could do. It's a very complex sphere of life. There's decades and decades of nefarious U.S. actions that have understandably, I think, engendered a type of conspiratorial attitude amongst many people who analyze U.S. foreign relations, because, truth be told, the United States has done a lot of conspiratorial things in the past. As everyone listening probably knows, the overthrow of democratically elected governments, what you all and Ben were just talking about with relations to Cuba. So there's a lot going on. So what we hope to do is sort of bridge the gap between what people in DC, or what might be referred to as the blob, think, and what people on the traditional anti-imperialist left think, which we think there's a lot there to both to the critique coming from the anti-imperialist side, but also relate it to how people in DC talk, to build, we were all speaking about Michael Brooks, to help kind of build the cadre of people who might one day, should a socialist win the presidency, it didn't happen this time, but it may happen in the future, who might one day go into office. And then this brings us to the question, of course, about Biden. And I think, and we could probably get into it a little bit more deeply, but what I see from the Biden administration is kind of an attempt to manage hegemony, a shrinking hegemony, whereas it's not a full retreat from, U.S. imperialism, but it is somewhat of a retreat from the unipolar moment, which is our lifetimes, essentially. We're all born in the 80s, growing up in the 90s and 2000s, the idea that the United States is the only global superpower. And I think there's a recognition amongst the blob, again, that this is not going to be the case. It's no longer the case, in fact. So the question is, how do you manage this hegemony? And as I wrap up here, I just want to say, I don't think we're witnessing real imperial decline. I think we're witnessing some type of imperial retrenchment.
Now, Biden is a liberal, and you are a professional historian, one of the last, maybe, as you talk about a lot. But you're paid to study history, and your area of expertise is liberalism and foreign policy. So it's a good moment for you because Biden is a liberal and he's doing foreign policy. How would you describe liberalism as an idea or an ideology, and what is kind of the liberal foreign policy?
Sure. So I think when I'm talking about liberalism in this way, I'm not really referring to, the Democratic Party is liberal or the Republican Party is conservative. But you are right, Nando. I think Biden is a liberal in many senses of the term. What I'm really referring to here is this idea that started to get going in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was originally associated with the capital P progressive movement, which was the notion that you would be able to genuinely manage international affairs, that international affairs was a realm of action in which, great men, obviously men, literally, at the time, at the turn of the century, would be able to sort of rearrange international politics to fit into ideals. Woodrow Wilson famously did this with, the idea of ethnic nationhood, essentially, that happened at the end of World War I. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did it with the type of world making that happened toward the end of World War II. And all of Roosevelt's successors, from Truman on down to Biden, really think that you could remake the world. So one of the things that I think a left-wing criticism could do, what Derek Davison and I are trying to do on the podcast, American Prestige, is to really attack that worldview. This idea that international affairs is a place to be managed scientifically. It's a place to be managed like a chessboard. You often hear that metaphor of international affairs as sort of the great game. But the problem is it's not a game. And to view it like that through that metaphor, I think actually distorts what the United States is able to do, has accomplished or not accomplished in the world, and what a future left-wing foreign policy might look like given the realities of geopolitics.
It's like a game of Risk, dude. Right.
Exactly.
Move the pieces here, and you take over the Ukrainian steppes, and then you invade from the north, and you do a pincer movement, and then you're good.
And one of the things that we see in American culture day in and day out in ways we don't even recognize is that message is taught in everything from our high school curricula to our movies to our video games. Americans are taught that they're the actors of history, they're the heroes of history, and I think that attitude, which really got going at the turn of the 20th century, but peaked when the United States became an empire during and after World War II, is really damaging. That it winds up distorting what might be considered more organic developments on the ground. And I think you can understand U.S.-Cuba policy, right, in that regard. This idea that the United States has anything to say, the idea that America should manage Cuba in a meaningful way, which has been going on since the 19th century, is, I think, part of this fantasy that you are able to manage international relations, the fantasy that ultimately undergirds both the liberal internationalism of someone like Samantha Power or Hillary Clinton or Anne Marie Slaughter, and the neoconservatism of someone like Paul Wolfowitz or Donald Rumsfeld or Doug Feith or Richard Pearl. This notion that you could control politics in that way is, I think, misguided.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about just the kind of education Americans get while they're in grade school about U.S. history and our role internationally speaking. And I hate to bring this up because I feel bad at how terrible the co-host looked during this interaction, but I thought about Ryan Grimm's interaction with the other person he's been hosting with on The Rising. I don't know her name, but how shocked she was in regard to what really went down during World War II and Stalin's role in defeating the Nazis, right? And she was just like shocked because the overwhelming narrative in the United States and in our education system is like, and then the United States got involved and defeated the Nazis single-handedly without any help from anyone else.
Tom Hanks beat the Nazis.
Yeah.
And particularly in our lifetimes, in all of our 3 lifetimes, this was really the narrative of the 1990s, right? Because without the Soviet Union, this empire should go away, right? You're justifying it for literally 2 generations because the Soviet Union, they're horrible, they're evil, blah, blah, blah. But the Soviet Union collapses between 89 and 91. And so the empire should come home, right? But what happened, of course, is that they needed a new justification for empire. And that justification winds up becoming preventing genocide for a variety of particular historical circumstances, particularly the United States' failure to intervene in Rwanda in 94, and then in the collapsed Yugoslavia in 1995, the anniversary of this, I always pronounce it incorrectly, the Srebrenica, forgive me, massacre. And so what happened was this new justification for empire became the Holocaust, right? Became the prevention of genocide. And so along with the dissemination of this meta narrative, this literally like Hegelian narrative of history, became a downplaying of what the Soviet Union did. And of course, with regard specifically to the Holocaust, it was the Soviet Union that liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, because the death camps, when we think of, there were concentration camps where people were concentrated and lots of people died, don't get me wrong, but there were death camps that were specifically built for extermination. Those were in Eastern Europe because Hitler didn't want them in Germany and for a variety of reasons. So they were liberated, the ones that were still functioning at the war's end, by the Soviet Union. So literally the liberators, the enders of the specific Eastern genocide of the Jews was the Soviet Union. And that was totally erased from history. And so it's 30 years later now. And you have a generation of people who are politicized by narratives like that, who were raised on Saving Private Ryan, who were raised on Call of Duty, who have Call of Duty actually did have Russian soldiers, but whatever, who were raised without a sense that this was an effort that the United States didn't do alone, that it was actually, the sacrifice of tens of millions of Soviet citizens and many soldiers that enabled the victory of World War II. But instead, the lesson of World War II was U.S. global power. And I think that's a historically incorrect lesson, though it's the one that people have taken.
Yeah. You're known for some of your spicy takes, and one of your spicier ones was that you tweeted out that in a way you feared liberals more than you feared the people who stormed the Capitol, and people were very mad at you about that. It's obviously a provocation in a way, but what did you mean by that?
I honestly didn't think it was a provocation, because the way that I view it is in terms of a power analysis. So who controls the mechanisms of the American security state, both the domestic security apparatus, the surveillance of the NSA, ICE, Coast Guard, the police forces to some regard, and also, of course, the mechanisms of international security, the international security apparatus, the U.S. military, and all of its various branches and the weapons that it maintains. And so what I was doing was just, the analysis between the actual controllers of the liberal American states versus the Capitol rioters. And so it really didn't seem like a provocation, because at the time, I mean, obviously, and I don't want to underplay, it's obviously very scary for someone to personally experience that if you were in Congress or if you were there. This is not, something to dismiss easily, people's concerns. But when you're looking at it from a political perspective, what I was worried about at the time was that exaggerating something which I didn't view as a threat to the Republic, which is literally how it was being presented as, it was a coup attempt, which means the attempt to literally take over the control of the government, never really seemed like that to me. It seemed like something bad, a riot, and certainly had some very unsavory motivations, racism, xenophobia, hero worship of Trump, etc. What I was worried about was the overreaction by the American state, because I think the last 20 years has shown, and one might even say, as someone who studies the formation of this state in the 40s, since World War II, the last 76 years have shown that the state tends to expand its powers, and particularly the state tends to expand its security powers, and it is often looking for excuses to do so. So what I was just pointing out at the time was that this should really be the fear of this enormously powerful apparatus that could know where any one of us is at any moment, and through the mechanism of the drone could literally kill anyone in theory. It's something to be really worried about, and I think I was justified in that worry, given the recent moves by the Biden administration to do things like characterize DVEs, believe it's domestic violent extremists, as people who are anarchists or anti-capitalists, and things that might might be associated with the left. And I'll just continue here. I just have to say, in American history, one of the groups that have suffered most from this empowerment of the security state have been people of color, have been the left, and have been people who are dissidents to the status quo authority.
So I want to move over to Cuba. I know we've discussed it quite a bit on the show already, but I'm getting word regarding Jen Psaki's statements about what the U.S. plans to do. Press Secretary Jen Psaki says U.S. approach to Cuba is governed by two principles: empowering the Cuban people, even though we're still keeping sanctions in place, which cripples its economy. Second, Americans, especially Cuban Americans, are the best ambassadors for freedom and prosperity in Cuba.
Right. So she said that. Yeah, right. So this is the classic Biden. Sorry, I'm moving out of frame. This is classic Biden administration of maintaining hegemony. That's a status quo foreign policy, right? Like the continuation of the sanctions that have been going on, as you talked about, for decades, a reliance on sort of the Cuban American community to guide U.S.-Cuban relations. Frankly, I think this points to a general problem. Is that because Cuba is just not on the top of the list of concerns for the overwhelming number of Americans. So in many of these issues, particularly in terms of foreign policy, but also domestic policy, highly organized groups are going to have a significant interest on what goes on. And this has been going on since the formation of lobbying groups in the 19th century, oftentimes along ethnic lines. And so I think that's basically a throwing your hands up. Biden's not going to do a Bay of Pigs, because that would be really bonkers. And he's not even going to do the sort of drone surveillance that was done in Waziristan, for example, over the last several years. But he's just going to say, we're going to let things run their course. The United States is going to continue to do sanctions. We're going to continue to do what we've been doing for decades. And nothing's going to change because because the Western Hemisphere, since the announcement of the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, that's the United States'. And I just want to point out, this is when it's very absurd when people ever accuse the United States of being isolationist, because from the very beginning of the beginnings of the country's history, one could view, I think correctly, as the expansion westward, as the displacement of native indigenous peoples, as, an expansionist, non-isolationist foreign policy. And then over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the domination of Latin America and the entire Western Hemisphere could hardly be understood as isolationist. So I just think it's important to highlight that historical point, because the word isolationism is used and misused far too often.
Like as we mentioned before with Ben, this has been our little tribute to our mutual friend Michael Brooks, and we're asking if there was, if there's one lesson that you took from him that that you carry with you, what that would be.
I'd say Michael, more than most, genuinely had that internationalist vision of a left-wing movement that has, for understandable and predictable reasons, fallen out of favor the last few decades. And I always really admired that about him, to really make international affairs a centerpiece of the show in order to show his listeners, to reveal to his listeners what was going on in the world. I always really admired that about him. He really made it a focus. And I also just admired his ability to, make fun of things when they needed to be made fun of, but also his ability to talk to different groups of the left and try to tamp down intra-left fighting when it wasn't necessary, but also to promote it when it was necessary. I thought he had a very good judge of that sort of thing. And as Ben said, his loss is just an enormous one. And it's wild that it's been a year. It feels like both no time and all the time. And it's just an enormous loss, incalculable loss for those of us who knew him and for the movement at large.
Yeah, totally agree with you on that. Danny, thank you for joining us. Daniel. I tried to do like a combination of Danny and Daniel, but anyway, thank you for joining us. Loving your podcast so far, so keep it going. Before you go, what can the audience expect from the podcast moving forward? Your first episode was on Afghanistan. What are you planning for the future?
So this week we're going to have a podcast episode with my and Derek's friend Matt Chrisman, where we take kind of this big, long view of U.S. foreign relations going back to the founding of the Republic. We're going to have upcoming interviews with other foreign policy experts, someone like Aziz Rana, who's written for M+1, and basically listeners could view the show if they don't really have the time during the week to pay too much attention to international affairs. What we're going to do, and frankly inspired by what Michael used to do, to put cards on the table, is try to go in depth on issues that are sort of in the news, but give them the type of beyond the news of the week, a larger understanding of what's going on as we interview people to try to figure out what should the United States do in the world, what is going on in the world, and what should we on the left be aware of in order to build this sort of utopian internationalist thing that I think is at the heart of leftist political thought.
Love it.
Can't wait.
Thank you, Daniel. All right. See you soon. All right. Loving the show so far. Love these conversations. But now it's time to focus on Michael. As we've mentioned, it's been 1 year since he passed away. But there is one person who's working really, really hard to make sure that his work continues and that his legacy is known. And that's his sister, Lisha Brooks. Lisha, thank you for joining us.
Hi, how are you guys?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm in Montana and I've had Wi-Fi issues, so.
Whoa, that's cool.
Yeah, it is.
I've never
but
been
enough
to
about
Montana.
Montana.
Are there big mountains there? What's it like? Is
there
it
are
very
big
mountainous?
mountains. We saw a grizzly bear.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's America is simply too big. I think is what I'm learning. I mean, I've always kind of felt that, but there's so many countries in this country. I know people say that, but when you're driving it, you really feel that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, every time I go to a different part of the country, I feel like I'm in a different country. Like the culture is different, the, geological, elements are different. But anyway, I feel like I'm talking about weather now. I'll move on. Let's talk about what you're doing. And it's work that I really appreciate because I think that the left is in a pretty, tumultuous time. And Michael provided a lot of clarity. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but certainly for me in terms of how to think about both domestic and foreign policy, right? How the left should position itself in incredibly controversial issues. And he was also very much willing to say things that might lead to some backlash, but needed to be said. Like one thing that comes to mind is his willingness to kind of debunk some of the talking points coming from, like, let's say a Tulsi Gabbard, right? Who presented herself as like some leftist or some socialist, when in reality she was anything but. So talk about what you're doing with the Michael Brooks Legacy Project and what you hope to accomplish through that work.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a few different jumping off points there. And I feel like at the heart of Michael's work was his ability to both like hold many contradictions and nuance and kind of opposing ideas at times, but then also to simplify. And it was really just in Michael, the individual, he was able to kind of create that synthesis. And I think in his passing, it's hit people how much of that he was holding, and how much, you know, it keeps coming up again and again. Kind of, he was someone who seemed to be able to kind of hold under one big tent a lot of people on the left. And we've felt that a bit of a breakdown post his passing. But a beautiful thing that has happened is a lot of people have found out about his work, and he's, you know, his work continues to go viral. It continues to impact people's education, understanding of situations as they, you know, develop even post his passing. I was speaking with a man yesterday who discovered Michael after Dr. Cornel West had tweeted about his passing. And he spent the last year just watching all of Michael's content. And he was telling me a story the other day, you know, and this is not uncommon. This is something I'm coming across a lot. So quite simply with the legacy work, what we're trying to do is just put Michael's work back out there. We're re-airing the episode every week. We started with the premiere of TMBS, which a lot of people missed. You know, you guys probably missed. You know, Ben probably missed. A lot of people like started, you know, listening later in. So that's been a fun thing to do. I've been interviewing people kind of behind a paywall on Patreon, just because it's a kind of personal project, and you know, it's nice to have it be like a little bit more of like a private community at this point. But that project is awesome. Thanks, Kale. No relation, but kismet spirit. That project, and I hope you guys will all come on. I've been kind of moving chronologically, so we've started with people that knew Michael as a kid and worked his way through his, you know, adolescence and teen years, and we're kind of now in college, post-college. But that is actually kind of my homework for a documentary we're making about Michael's work and life. And then the last thing I want to say, kind of just, you know, both talking about the very literal nature of the legacy work, but then also kind of like what the bigger kind of project and mission is. Because again, Michael was really good at self-promoting. He had a big ego. He had a lot of like, you know, he wanted to be this like big star, but the other part of him was like very focused on like not creating a cult of personality, not becoming obsessed with individual, you know, like he, again, it's like these multiple things he would hold. And David Griscom is working we're putting together a book project. And one of the videos we recently revisited was something where Michael talked about the difference between pity and solidarity. And that was originally taught to us as a Buddhist principle between like pity and compassion. And I've just been coming back to that a lot when I think about kind of when people say like, I don't know, what's a guiding principle or how to distill Michael's work. And I think that there are a lot of people who actually really do want to stand with their fellow humans, and they really do want the world to be a better place. And I think there's like a lot of judgment and division on the left and between liberals. And I've just been having a lot of conversations with people who like oftentimes just don't know, and they're not necessarily, and of course there are people who do know and are bad actors, but a lot of people just are like looking for that. And I think one way to kind of engage with people and like a way in is like, okay, is your set of politics something where it's like, this is pity, I feel bad for these people, America needs to do something, or is it solidarity, how do we stand with them, what actions can we take to truly be aligned? So, you know, solidarity to the people of Haiti, solidarity to the people of Cuba. Yeah, I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but it's still kind of developing and growing, and there's a lot of different elements to legacy work, and there's a lot of different elements to Michael's work, so it's hard to kind of streamline.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say that whenever I do a decode segment for here on whatever topic, literally the first thing I do every time is go into YouTube and just type in Michael Brooks plus topic name. And that's how I just start, like that's how I start my research process for it. And it's just so remarkable, like the breadth of stuff that he was able to do in such a short period of time. But I wanted to ask about this, the project that you're doing for patrons, about, like you said, mentioned his more personal one about like his life and, his early years and things like that. What would be like a, just like a little snippet that you could give people that maybe aren't yet patrons, but could be, about like that would surprise, like say they're fans of Michael's, but like they would be surprised about something that you uncovered or that you covered or that you talked about in this project?
I guess one thing that comes to mind is when Michael was little, he would call into this local talk show. And I actually posted the clip of this tape I found on YouTube. So probably a good amount of people did see this excerpt. Michael identifies himself as Stephen. He's a homeschooler. He predicts Bill Clinton winning in the 1992 primary in New York at a time where like no one thought Clinton was going to win. Michael also calls Clinton an idiot and says that he's supporting.
Hello, you're on WNNZ.
Hello, this is Stephen from Ashfield, and I just got it. I think Clinton's going to win New York by a squeak.
I happen to agree with your analysis there. I think that Clinton has pulled some rabbits out of the hat in recent days. His appearance on the Phil Donahue show the other day was a brilliant performance, where Donahue kept trying to ask him about, whether he inhaled his marijuana and had an affair. And finally, the audience booed Donahue and said, look, we want to hear about education and Medicaid and how you're going to fix the economy. We don't want to hear about this junk anymore. But what do you base your analysis on, sir?
Well, I was hoping that I'm hoping that Brown wins it. I just think that it's kind of like Clinton's an idiot. And most of the people in New York, are kind of funked up. But so if he's going to go in New York, he's going to get voted for.
You've really been following this race. What's your first name?
My Stephen.
Stephen, and are you in school, Stephen?
No, I'm homeschooled.
You're homeschooled. How old are you?
Oh, I'm great. It's going great.
How old are you?
I'm 8 years old.
You're 8 years old, you're homeschooled, and you can discuss the presidential race more intelligently than more adults. Well, I'd say that's a good argument for homeschooling.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad to hear from you, Stephen, and you keep it up, and give me a call next week, and we'll see how good your prediction came.
Okay, bye.
Okay, thanks for your call.
Bye.
5-6.
So then later I'm talking to Matt Binder, several weeks later, and he goes, did you know that Al Giordano, who was the talk show host, and it's a little complicated, of like the...
Wait, that's Al Giordano? Like the Al Giordano?
Yes.
The same guy?
Yes. So I had no clue. And I guess that they were like Twitter enemies, and Al was very anti-Bernie and like a huge Hillary shill. And I knew none of this. And I have to go back and rewatch the interview with Al, which was a really nice interview. And, he was anti-nukes. He's kind of this like, hippie guy from where I grew up. I just assumed he was a Bernie guy. And I bet I mentioned Bernie a bunch. And I think I have to go back and watch it, but I think he's kind of weird when I'm kind of just like, well, after, our loss, he's kind of like... But
no,
my God,
he like stuck the knife in. Yeah, especially in 2016.
Yeah. So that was a funny, like, I don't know, that was like a surprise. That's not very personal to Michael, but I guess that's something fresh in my memory of just like a funny connecting the dots. I don't even know if Michael knew that Al was a person he called into as a kid, because it was just kind of like family lore. I doubt maybe he knew.
Probably very really remembered. I mean, how old was he? 6?
Yeah, he was 7. I feel like my parents were like, oh, he used to call into, WNNZ or whatever, like the radio station was. I don't really remember them saying the host's name. I doubt he was like so curious to know about himself. So, and also Al had gone on Sam's show on Air America. So there's just like these weird things that are kind of coming up that, kind of makes, I guess when someone passes away, things like sort of just like make sense in some ways in terms of like their trajectory or like the story of their life. But when they're such a young person and they're just beginning to build, you're not thinking of it like at the time. So it's been kind of interesting to go and piece together these parts of Michael's development. One other quick thing I'll say is I feel like a theme that comes up a lot are people telling me that Michael told them he wanted to be president, which I think he stopped saying as much at the time TMBS became popular. And then also his complicated, I call it his first heartbreak, but his love and then dismay at the trajectory of Obama and his politics is another big theme.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, yeah, I heard a lot of the very justified critique toward Obama, but I didn't know that, I mean, I think a lot of people had high hopes for Obama, especially considering like what campaign Obama was like and how incredibly different he was from President Obama, So that's really surprising. Can you share a little bit of that with us? Like what were his thoughts on Obama early on?
I mean, there's like, it's a theme that comes up a lot because Michael was in college, he's a little older than me. And I don't know, maybe you guys are, I don't know, but who cares? But when he was in college, it was a pretty bleak, it was like Kerry will maybe like the person on, the left, or we didn't really, I didn't say left, it was like, liberal or Democrat. And a lot of his peers are kind of just like reminding me of like, this was a really different time. Like Bush was terrifying and people didn't care as much. Like, the whole like boogeyman of Trump compared to like, people hated Bush, don't get me wrong, but like just the activation around it wasn't maybe as high. And they were like, Obama, and obviously some of Michael's heroes were very critical of Obama at that time. So it's not like that wasn't part of the equation, but for like your average student, there was this really exciting candidate and, he had such charisma and such passion and spoke so beautifully about this future. And I think a lot of people, I mean, my high school, like we had the afternoon off, we watched the inauguration, people were like partying in the halls. I mean, it was like a really joyous event. And so I think it's been, and this does not diminish, I'm not trying to like in any way downplay the horrific things that happened during that presidency. I'm just saying it's kind of like a good reminder to go back and like kind of just be honest about like where we were and how people felt. And I think kind of talking to folks about Michael's political evolution is interesting because he always was extremely left. I mean, obviously we have him as a kid criticizing Bill Clinton and like, there is this, him as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old walking around with Fidel Castro book under his arm. Like he really always had that, but debating people about Israel at Shabbat dinners. But anyways, I digress. But, at the same time, the culture was like, it was cool to kind of be like moderate and liberal in a way that now it's cool to be, more radical and left. And I think it's kind of healthy mentally to kind of just acknowledge this and like talk about this because I feel like now things have gotten so intense with everyone policing each other about like who's legit and who's not, and it doesn't give us
you
time
mentioned that, Lisha, because I last night I watched the new pilot for the HBO show White Lotus, and there's like a scene where these like two hot Zoomer girls they're at a resort. The show takes place in a resort in Hawaii, like a high-end resort, and there's like these two like really hot Zoomer girls, and they're at their dinner table like kind of chatting amongst themselves like before like the dinner conversation starts, like everyone's kind of sitting down, and like one of the girls is like, she was a neo-lib and a neocon, like they're clearly talking about Hillary, and the mom's like, what'd you say? Are you talking about Hillary? Hillary Clinton? Like it's like, oh, it's cool now to, I guess, amongst the young people to like bash Hillary Clinton. Well, to women my age, like she's a hero, blah 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 blah. But it's like I love that idea that like the cool Zoomers now, like these like hot girls in bikinis, like she was the neo-lib and a neocon.
It's amazing.
I'm surprised to hear that because I've actually, the show's been recommended to me. I want to check it out. But like, even from where I sit, I feel like getting that like approved in Hollywood feels like a feat. Like, I feel like I literally burned bridges and lost contacts over like being critical of Warren, not to mention Hillary, and people like can't hear. I preferred Bernie over Hillary, not I wanted Trump to win over Hillary. Like, I don't quite understand why that's like a mental breakdown for people, but it seems to continue to be.
No,
I haven't watched that show, but just based on your description of it, Nando, it speaks to what you mentioned, Lisha, like the policing, right? Like who's a better leftist or who's further to the left and who's more moral, or like I feel like a lot of the discourse among the left has kind of devolved into discussions about like I don't know, posturing and morality as opposed to like a material analysis that I think Michael did a really good job in. Like his material analysis was always involved in like any story he was covering, especially like, foreign policy. Like a lot of the discussion right now is like imperialism, good or bad. And it's like, no, we're having a moral discussion, and sure, we can have that discussion, but like, can we talk about like the actual material drivers and like the real motivators and factors behind the scenes that drive U.S. imperialism? And I think he did a really good job in covering that, but also in covering it in a nuanced way. Like you mentioned the contradictions, and like he would always talk about the dialectic, right? And I wish I had fully understood that when he was alive. Like he would use the word dialectic and I didn't know what it meant, but I saw him practicing it. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's
you knew it when
missing
you
now.
saw
Like,
it. It's like porn, like you know it when you see it.
That's what I've always thought about
exactly
my
like that.
The dialectic is like porn. Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting you say that, and I think too, like a really dangerous thing with kind of this like, oh, to be this way, it's cool now. Part of that is kind of exciting, and like I'm excited by it, but it's also people can just sense the BS, and so when you're trying to like build like this kind of global political project of solidarity, if your like political project is based on like having the right meme or like the most left set of like hot takes, and it's going to be alienating to other people. And I think that was essentially something that, I truly get emails and messages about it all the time. Like the way Michael was kind of like synthesizing, putting stuff out there, it pulled people into the tent. It didn't push them away. And I think that that's definitely something that worries me, that I kind of see as a pattern. I had a smarter point to make there. Oh, I know what it was. So we're doing a Brooks Books Club as part of the legacy work, just kind of revisiting some books that Michael enjoyed. And today we were talking to Haman Najdid, who wrote The Ministry of Guidance Invites You Not to Stay. And he lived in Iran for a year in 2012 during Ahmadinejad was in power. And he just kind of wrote about living there and like what that experience was. Like, obviously it's like, a liberal point of view, but it's not like a super political book. It's just kind of like almost like an Anthony Bourdain episode of like, his experience there. And there was just something so Michael really responded to that book. And I think, this is like a piece of literature that just kind of like makes Iran like a real place where like people sometimes get in trouble with the morality police and sometimes don't, and people drinking's illegal, but they still get booze, and there's disagreements about this, and it just humanizes. And I think that again was just like such a thing that Michael was doing, which was kind of like humanizing. One more thing, just because I everything's kind of percolating right now, but I just got an email from a fan who lives in Gaza, and he said Michael inspired him to look outside of Israel and Palestine, and he was learning all about Brazil and Venezuela and that struggle. And I just think that by kind of bringing just so many different struggles and just kind of putting them in just like a very grounded, real framing, it was inspiring people to just feel solidarity in such a like beautiful, interconnected network. And I really hope that your guys' work Bros, Danny Bessner's new show, Ben Burgis, all of Michael's kind of larger web of people, you guys are able to continue to put out that kind of content. And because I'm seeing in real time the amount of people that Michael, one individual, was able to influence in a positive way is like, he didn't know, I didn't know. It's really I don't really quite have words for it.
I'm just not as good as him.
Yeah,
not as good.
That's what I was gonna offline. I was gonna talk to you about that.
Tell me about it. Just remind me. Yeah, you'll never be as good as him.
No, I mean, you don't want to like deify and make it like Saint Michael, but I think it just, he for whatever reason had some multiple burners on at once, and I think it's inspiring to do that.
His ability to like very clearly disagree with someone without like without it leading to a major conflict was, I mean, masterful. I'm too fiery. Like I agree with you, Nando. Not about you, but mostly about me. Like there's a certain temperament that he brought to the table that I lack personally. But I am who I am. I can't change it. I'll try to kind of keep it under control for this show, but mostly because I don't want to be reprimanded. But yeah, I think that he had this incredible ability of bringing people together and engaging in conversations where a disagreement might be front and center, but he didn't, divide people based on those disagreements. He tried to find ways to persuade, to bring people into, this broader coalition. And I really respected that. That was something that I was trying to learn from as much as possible. What would you say? I know that you had a lot of political discussions with him that oftentimes would get fiery. I mean, you've opened up a little bit about that in the past. What would you say, you learned from Michael, politically? Like, what's one thing that like he persuaded you on, maybe?
It's a little, I'm trying to think of like one concrete example. I think Michael had just like bigger, wider thinking. And I think I was like quicker to respond to like, if there was like one case of injustice or one person was upset about this, I think that I kind of have that tendency. So I think a lot of what we like kind of would debate about would be like the merits of certain like maybe social movements. Like he would be kind of a few steps ahead of me and seeing how they would be co-opted to basically make us all feel other from each other. And it's kind of hard to articulate because some of these things I don't want to like name a certain one because it's hard. For some reason, not one example is coming to mind of something like, oh, Michael really changed my mind on that. But I just think that without Michael, I don't know until this year when like just like TikTok popped off and there's just been kind of like this whole like wider education around like I grew up with a sibling who was just so anti-imperialist, so aware of like so many parts of the world. So this isn't really something he changed my mind about, but I just always grew up having just this person in my life who was just so focused on the international and just seemed to have like this very strong grasp on how people's lives were in different regions, in different states, in different countries. And just kind of that was always part of the conversation. So that's kind of sort of broadly what comes to mind. Like, I don't know if I would have like had like, I just always knew like what was up in Cuba. Like, I just always knew like what was going on in Haiti. I knew how the Clintons were involved in what was going on, like from a young age. And I don't know if I would have, I had some really cool lefty radical teachers. I had a like English teacher who had a crush on Hugo Chavez. Like I had some unusual people who are part of my education track that's like not the norm, but just day to day to have Michael in my house. I don't know that, and is that funny? The anecdote about the teacher was definitely a big influence.
People remember Hugo Chavez in the latter years, but I think a huge part of his appeal in Venezuela in the early years, when he attempted a coup d'état in the early '90s as a trim, buff, like military. I think he was like a sergeant or colonel. I don't know what rank he was, but like. He had his appeal. I don't.
Nando was the English teacher. Sorry to out you.
Yeah, that was me. Sorry, I was.
Well, yeah, I hope that was concise. I kind of just jotted down a bunch of stuff, and I didn't really get it super in order, but I feel like that hopefully gave y'all a good taste of kind of what we're trying to work on.
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Everyone, please go check out the Michael Brooks Legacy Project Patreon page. Become a patron and support this work because it's important. I mean, and I agree with you, Nando. There have been so many stories that, broke following his passing where I want clarity on the issue and I'll look it up, and he's just covered so many topics. Like the variety of topics that he delved into was pretty impressive. So thank you for keeping that work alive, Lisha. It means a lot to me personally, means a lot to us. But more importantly, it means a lot to individuals who are, trying to learn more about politics and, more importantly, the left. They're not going to get that education in like traditional schools in the US. And I think what Michael did was such an important service. So thank you for keeping that alive.
Yeah, I think also This Is Revolution's doing some cool stuff too. I know I just listed a bunch of left. There's a lot of good people doing stuff. So, check it out. Thank you guys.
All right.
I appreciate you.
Thanks for joining us,
honor
Lisha.
Michael. All right. Bye.
Thank you for joining us. Have a good one. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Michael on a more personal level. Cale Brooks is joining us now. Cale, how you doing?
Yeah,
no
again,
relation.
I have to. It's a little strange, but of course, it's like also a massive honor when someone's like, "Were you related to Michael?" And it's like, no, I was his producer, which is not quite family, but I want to just say thank you again to Ben, to Danny, to Lisha, that we really do appreciate you joining us today for the show, and then also sharing your anecdotes and your stories, and kind of the part of this is that I wanted everyone to kind of talk about what in what ways Michael kind of affected their politics, because something that I keep coming back to, or I have been coming back to since last year, is something will happen and I'll say, among the many tragedies that Michael's death is, if only we had someone who would be able to like speak so cogently or so brilliantly on this thing, that like we lost someone who was so multifaceted in his talents. And then it to Nando's point earlier of like it wanting to be as good as him and knowing that we're not. I mean, that I feel that all the time, and that's like, in some ways it's been a motivation, but it's I think I said a year ago, in the tribute that it just became so much more clear to me that we have to step up, that we have to to fill in what Michael left us, because he was doing it so much better than everyone else. And that
Cale, you're still young. I'm old and I'm not going to change. I'm tapped out. I'm about as good as I'll be. You're still young. You still got a lot of room for potential growth. I think you could step up, dude.
No. That's very flattering, but like there is certain qualities about Michael that are just truly irreplaceable, that like I can read as much as I want to read and will never be as like in the moment witty and funny as he was. I'll never be like, there's certain aspects of just the personality that I just think are just so important to how people understand what the left is. That like the words I keep coming back to, or have been coming back to, is that like, yes, Michael was brilliant, Michael was funny, but he was kind, and like
super kind, but also salty in all the right ways. Like let's not bury that, because I'll say this. What I saw from Michael, outside of how intellectual he was and how funny he was, there was a lot of courage in what he was willing to cover, honestly, when he knew that there would be insane backlash, because he did the work, right? Like if you do the work, if you do the research and the reading, and you have a firm grasp on whatever issue you're talking about, sometimes you realize things before everyone else. And like I gave the example of Tulsi Gabbard, because I remember doing the work on Tulsi Gabbard, and I'm like, this woman is a fraud, and it's just so abundantly clear if you do the work. But the only other person who did that was Michael, and he had the courage to speak out regarding her, her anti-regime change rhetoric and what was really behind it. Because she did position herself as like this anti-war candidate. But it wasn't really based in any principled ideology, right? Like every argument she had was really about, oh, it's going to be a waste of resources. These forever wars are not good for our troops. Like, and he was just able to kind of like debunk the nonsense, and did it fearlessly. And he got, look, I remember those days. Like I remember the backlash I got. I remember the backlash he got, but he kept doing the right thing over and over again. And I really, really appreciated that courage from him. in addition to how smart he was, how clear he was, and also how funny he was.
And also just, I can remember moments where something would come up on the show, whether it be this show or TMBS, where he clearly didn't know about that topic. And he would just say like, yeah, I don't actually think I can comment on this because I don't know something about it, which speaks to the fact that when he was speaking, he probably had in fact done so much of the research that like the amount, like it wasn't just something he was pulling out of his ass. Like some of it, of course, like he had, you know, incredible political intuitions and instincts, and that matters a great deal. And so he could, you know, respond to things as they were coming up, but he also said, I need to know what I'm talking about. And doing this show just for like a year and a half, it's really tough to follow the news. I don't want to watch the news ever, but I have to, because like I have to have an opinion on it if I come on screen for something. And like, you know, talking about Cuba, and I'm like, oh God, I wish I had finished reading that book on Cuba, you know, 2 years ago that, you know, I never finished. And it's like, but Michael had, you know, taken so much time to take that in and to understand the world around him, and then matched it with like a socialist worldview. So that, you know, not only was he articulating a politics, but he was doing it by, you know, actually, relating it to real events, real, you know, research, real information. And that's like, for a lot of people, that's, you know, in the way that Lisha was saying, I mean, like, that's a lot of the way that most people understand the world. They don't get it in the big, heady kind of, you know, from the, you know, the God's eye view that, you know, Marxists sometimes are like accused of seeing the world in just these giant macro categories. Like he really did try to understand, you know, how are things happening really on the ground in people's lives across the world, and then trying to understand how does that fit in with my political beliefs. And again, I think that like that's a quality that the left is sorely lacking. That I think the left, like previous generations, did have that, and I think Michael knew that, and that's like he spent so much of his time training in that process and in that legacy. And again, I think it's worth stating this because like that's effectively what the left should be doing. Like that's the kind of like aspects of Michael that we need to be recreating constantly, I think.
Yeah.
So why don't we share our favorite Michael? Well, I mean, to say favorite Michael videos, I think is a strong way of stating it, because I mean, I can't pick a favorite, but I did choose a video to share with you all that I think does a good job kind of demonstrating what I've been referring to regarding his like nuanced takes on controversial issues, foreign policy, things like that. So should I go first, or do you guys want to go first? I don't mind.
No, we should do it. We should start with that one. So I'm gonna.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Let's watch.
There's a countervailing tendency where, you know, if somebody's opposed to U.S. interests, we have to sanitize them. We can't have an intellectually rigorous conversation. I think that doesn't work, because I actually mainly, even just frankly, for if you wanted to look at it in terms of propaganda purposes, I don't think that kind of bullshitting about everything works. Mm-hmm. And I would actually make a really hard and fast distinction, frankly, between the enormous complexity of something like China, which we just need to learn how to be adults about, which is going to push back against the new Cold War, fear-mongering, war-mongering attempt. Also combine the fact that that push against China is delusional. I mean, how much are you really going to bully a rising power where your entire supply chain relies on them? And that it is very important to understand how China looks at the world, how they conduct their foreign policy. And then at the same time, I think it's ridiculous and foolhardy to make excuses of where China, you know, abuses rights or whatever else. I just think it's silly. And also, you have to look at the entirety of Asia. In the Middle East, you know, there's big variance here in terms of Iran, Syria, wherever else. But, and again, abuses committed by these various governments and leaders like Assad. But the main story is pushing away U.S. interventionism, U.S. imperialism, which is extraordinarily aggressive in the Middle East, obviously.
That's it. That's everything. That's it. It's simple. It's simple. It's so simple. And for some reason, the left has difficulty in doing something simple. U.S. intervention, U.S. imperialism is bad. It does not lead to any positive outcomes. At the same time, when you're needlessly sanitizing human rights abuses, all you're doing is losing people who might be open to your arguments, right? I mean, that was kind of part of the reason why I was a little more willing to kind of disregard the left prior to watching Michael's content, because there was like a lack of honesty about things, right? There was a lack of nuance. And so, and I don't, like, if you're working in media as a member of the left, it's not your job to whitewash things to prevent US intervention, right? Your job is to inform people. So like whenever I'd see someone who identified as a leftist and then like needlessly whitewashed things or brushed human rights abuses under the rug or pretended like it didn't exist, I was like, I don't know, is this credible? Because this is not a nuanced look at what's really going down. I think that you can very clearly, and Michael did this on a regular basis, acknowledge those things, not insult the people who are being abused, by the way. And then at the same time, give very specific reasons why US intervention would be awful and would actually further exacerbate the issue or the problems for the citizens of whatever country you're talking about at any given moment. Anyway, that's what I really appreciated about Michael. He had the ability to discuss these things in a real way with all the contradictions that exist, with all the nuances that exist. And he brought me into the left as a result of that. He didn't push me away with judgment, like constant judgment on the left right now. Like, it's not helpful, right? And so I really appreciated that about him. And I think that clip is a good way of, you know, demonstrating what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the left, I mean, broadly, I think it's, you know, in some ways, the left is maybe more healthy on this issue than it has been historically on the issue of imperialism. That I think the vast majority of the left sees imperialism as bad, but then I think for a lot of it, it can become very flat. That's just American empire is big and bad. And, you know, when something bad happens in the world, it's because American empire is big and bad. And what I think Michael brought to this that was really necessary is what you're talking about, is this nuance and the focus on interests, of trying to understand who is doing what, you know, whose interests are being served by, you know, what means. And when you try to understand that, instead of just kind of a flatter picture of what's going on, it then actually helps us generate political solutions, because then we can identify who is actually benefiting, who is actually operating, and then we can actually, you know, appreciate, I think it both political solutions within the US, but then also try to understand political solutions internationally of, you know, in a population, you know, for instance, like you can hold two things in your mind at the same time, that like the US has in fact and continues to have, you know, what we call imperial domination and imperial power over much of Latin America, for instance. I think it's also fair to say that, you know, it's not quite the same hold over the region that it maybe had 50, 60 years ago. And we had Greg Grandin on to talk about this actually last Saturday. But, you know, and then we can understand, you know, how the domestic ruling classes, or the domestic ruling classes in these countries are, you know, exploiting, dominating, oppressing their own populations, and how working class people are fighting against their own ruling classes, in addition to American power and influence and collaboration with local ruling classes. And trying to understand and hold all these things in your mind simultaneously is like, it's tough. And, you know, there's a lot of important regional variances and specificities. And I think Michael really, you know, went the distance in trying to understand all of this.
Yeah, I mean, his coverage of Brazil is a good example, because the impulse on the left that you guys are talking about, I think, comes from a somewhat understandable place, that like you're being barraged by so much propaganda and so much misinformation from the mainstream press whenever it comes to anything foreign affairs, that, you know, it's so overwhelming that you there's a tendency, and I think kind of somewhat understandable impulse to just like discredit the whole thing, that like if it's in the New York Times, it's a lie, and I think that his coverage of Brazil, like Lava Jato, which got like unbelievable amounts of coverage in the mainstream press, 60 Minutes, all that stuff. I mean, he was able to process that amount of propaganda, and then regurgitate it back in forceful, clear, and without acknowledging certain realities on the ground that are quite messy about like what it means to govern a country like Brazil, given the historical context of the way the Brazilian state was constituted and organized. That like, yes, of course, corruption exists. Like to say it's like some clean, perfect democratic state is ridiculous. But to understand, to keep the sort of moral clarity and the overall strategic clarity to cover that in a way that is robust, forceful, and clear. And I mean, another good example, I think it might even be from this clip, if like a little later, but like, when he's talking about Venezuela and the amount of propaganda that comes out in the mainstream press about Venezuela, but like, about their, like how it's like a narco state and all that stuff. And he's like, well, there is an element of the fact that, the regimes in Venezuela have done some strategic what we would call maybe public-private partnerships with like narco elements. Is there also like a reason why Venezuela hasn't? Is that one of the reasons why Venezuela has not been toppled by the United States? Probably. Like it's a clear understanding of that phenomenon that is that is just one step beyond the sort of barrage of propaganda that we are getting from the mainstream press, which is just it's overwhelming. Like if you're not kind of constantly reading about like this kind of like any specific place, it's just so hard to sift through what is fact and what is just pure fiction. But he was just able to do it. I mean, he was just able to do it because he was better than most.
Yeah. Nando, how about you set up your clip?
Sure. I mean, I think my clip is a good example of, again, a clarity of analysis, a rigorous kind of Marxian application of all that he had learned and on all that he had understood, a sort of perfect way to apply a very clear and specific analysis to whatever controversy is happening in the current moment. And I don't even know I don't even remember like what specifically this was. I just remember it was like some debate between Nathan Robinson and Glenn Greenwald. It doesn't really matter. The point is like his response to it, his ability to sort of apply a very clear and specific and rigorous analysis, I thought was just absolutely perfect.
Glenn is right in terms of what he's pointing to vaguely, but actually the specifics there are wrong. It would not be a fully economically populist policy at all. And the thing that always, the basic dividing line, and please watch Dustin Guastella and I go into this, is the relationship to organized labor. Organized labor is the actual fulcrum of alternative power to capital. These guys don't you listen to Steve, and this is where if you listen to Steve Bannon and you look at the policies pursued by these guys, it's country club bullshit. They hate labor unions. Tucker Carlson makes a ton of individually discrete, accurate points about inequality and middle class disappearing, whatever, always turns it into xenophobia and race baiting, and occasionally a modest policy push, never labor. So the people who are disingenuously saying that Glenn Greenwald is promoting Steve Bannon's racism, that's disgusting, stupid, embarrassing, don't do it. And Glenn, in my view, is mistaken because, yes, if the most economically populist perspective that was being put forward by someone like Steve Bannon was implemented, it would basically mean that there would be some decent stuff on trades, decent stuff on infrastructure, and some okay taxation. And that's fine, and that is in no way equivalent to the Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, robust, for real, pro-labor, single-payer agenda. And we listened on Red Scare, Bannon doesn't support single-payer. at least as of now. So just does not hold up, right? And that is really the key thing. Then the other two parts of this debate that I want to pay particular attention to. One, look, I think that it is unfair to Crystal, and I've seen and continued to watch the show. She's robustly articulating her points on things like police defunding. She's doing it. Third and fourth point. Well, actually, I mean, okay. One more thing on Glenn. Again, Glenn is attacked constantly by people who you're going to need to reveal a Lava Jato and a Snowden in order to approach the contribution he's been on. Okay, I have nothing but respect for Glenn Greenwald. And I also, in that same interview, he called Tucker Carlson's response to the BLM uprising grotesque. And I think he is very consistent in a view that he has of inside-outside politics. That's not our view. We have a view about capital versus labor. And that is a big, substantive difference. And I think it's actually even reflected in some of the conversations, the great conversations. I mean, Glenn broke the Lula story. I cannot emphasize how big a contribution that is. But he still, I could look at the whole Lula story through the lens of basically top-down class politics. And I wasn't interested in any corruption narrative, right? And I'm not making a question of who's right or who's wrong, but that's a fundamentally different way of looking at politics. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of things get conflated under that umbrella with left-wing politics. But if you have a serious material class dimension that anchors labor, ironically, for all of the dumb accusations of class reductionism or whatever, it does basically eliminate right-wing populism, because right-wing populism posits all sorts of imagined national communities and various other fantasies and does not have a labor analysis.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I think that is just a perfect example of someone who was able to take whatever controversy of the day. It doesn't even, I don't even remember what the actual specifics were, but
yeah, just every buzzword, every trigger word on the left came in that clip.
Right, exactly. But it's like it's when you apply a Marxist lens to your critique of whatever it is that is happening, you become much more precise in your analysis of that thing, and you recognize that other people have a different critique, and it just causes them to have certain political differences. It leads them down a different path. And a perfect example, and this is something that we talked about a lot with the Lula thing, is that he sees it in the lens of class politics, not in any other lens. In other people, there's good government type liberals and things like that, which they might be they would be offended by certain things that Lula did while he was in power, and he just sees it. He just saw it through the lens of a class politics, and within that lens, Lula was the guy that did the most. So that, I mean, I just found everything about that ability to take a very heated debate in which most people start talking past each other, and then apply a very coherent and specific and precise analysis to it. So it's just something that I always try to do whenever I look at something. I try to take a step back, remember my training, like Obi-Wan. He's like my Obi-Wan in my ear, and use the Force, Luke, and then I'll be able to strive to have as an analysis as precise as that.
Yeah, I mean, my clip, it's actually not too dissimilar. It's dissimilar enough. I didn't totally spike the football on producing today, but
it's late over there, dude.
Yeah,
it's almost midnight.
Dude, it's almost midnight.
Yeah, this is pre-taped if you can't tell. I don't know if we said that. So sorry. I appreciate any super chats that you're sending in right now.
Why are they responding to
me? Yeah. But I think Nando's point is exactly right, that it's politics is so much about how you actually frame what's going on through a certain lens, and I think that's what Michael did so well. That like, and again, I think he understood that he was among a particular tradition, among particular like, it wasn't something he invented, but it's something that, you know, when you're on the left, like, you have to develop your socialist politics and your socialist worldview because it's so counter to just kind of what the status quo is in society. And he did that, and then was able to actually articulate like what's going on presently and what the left has to do in response to it. So this is just a short excerpt. It's actually from Weekends. It's just one of these little gems that I came across earlier watching through clips of just like the thing that he would just kind of say as a comment. This wasn't a segment. It's just something he said. So
that basically the technology, really built into the technology, is the incentivizing of all of the cruelty, gossip, nonsense, and drama. And the kind of ultimate irony of seeking the intensity of that experience as just being, I mean, it happens outside, it happens across all politics, but it is really specifically antithetical to the left because it's completely antithetical to a culture of either, you know, frankly, like openness, strength, forgiveness, change, and also just sort of like being like fully paid up, hopefully, you know, like grown up on some level, and just, you know, the complete lack of humility, I think too, is also gross, because again, I think like, ironically, if it was building a culture where people could be much more open about all of our, you know, where they're relevant, most of them, you know, aren't, because like privacy is obviously an obvious thing, but like, you know, people's growth, people's mistakes, people's transgressions that everybody, I'm so sorry to say, has done. You know, it creates like this like punitive, insane madhouse atmosphere where there isn't an incentive structure to grow. So, and
that's
I think
so true.
It cuts across all, you know, all areas. And I think, you know, Taibbi definitely, obviously, identified some of it. And, you know, it was funny, you know, I asked Noam Chomsky about it, and I tried to ask him beyond that article on TMBS because I didn't want to sort of, it's a big question. And it's like so many of these things, like you try to get them outside of like various silliness on Twitter and get to like the real meat of things. And he was just like, yeah, the left better have a substantive commitment, in this case, to free speech. And the only reason this is even a question now is because it's happening not only to the left. Historically, the left has always been the one, whether it's state or private censorship, that has been primarily threatened. So, you know, yeah, it's not just like a question in so many ways of like not producing all these stupid and toxic cultures. It's also really recognizing that it's just antithetical if you actually have an appetite for still, you know, trying to do the big things.
Yeah, it's just the breaking through the noise, saying like our politics, our commitments, and like our actions, how we actually exist on the left, and what we're doing, whether it be the day-to-day, week-to-week, like you have to have certain goals in mind, you have to have certain frameworks in mind, and like that's why you're doing it. And there's a million incentives in our status quo that is pushing us in an opposite direction, and that's why, you know, just it's one more reason of like Michael being such like a beacon for like sanity, and like being able to like reorient people towards like, no, this is what we're going towards, and we have to stay focused on the goal.
His Lafayette talk, I go back to so much, so often. I feel like he had reached like his apotheosis with that talk. It was like one of the last things he did. And I feel like he had reached like his full maturity and potential, and had gotten so comfortable with his arguments and so confident with his arguments, that he was able to talk to a bunch of college kids and just be like, yeah, you know, like this, yeah. You know what I mean? Like he was so cool in that clip because he wasn't talking to the TMBS audience. He was talking to just regular college kids. It was if you notice, he's like a little different than when he talks to the TMBS audience. Just like, it's a committed audience. They're coming back week after week. This is like he's out in a new, and I like my thing that I always think about is like he was so confident at that point in his ability to talk to someone and convince them, if they were kind of predisposed in some way, was that he wasn't able to go on Rogan. Because I know he was convinced that he could convince Rogan to just become like a full-on like Marxist socialist. Like if he just got on his show, that he would just convince him, and that would then turn like millions more people into that. But I think about that a lot.
Yeah, I mean it's like it's a really funny anecdote, but it's also like it just speaks to the fact. I mean, we lost Michael like before his peak. Like he was not even in his prime, and that's, I think, I mean it's horrific, but it's also like that's what we have to like keep in mind, like that what Michael was doing so well is what needs to be emulated, because that's what works. I mean, like it just the like amazing outpour that immediately, and then over the past year that Lisha has been talking about, of people that are connecting with Michael's work. It's proof of concept. So yeah, again, very honored to be able to carry on this project that Michael was so instrumental in creating. I mean, just all of Jacobin YouTube. Like I was bugging Bhaskar for like 2 years before I jumped on to like do like video stuff on for Jacobin. I was into
Zoomer.
Yeah, well, no, I'm a cuss millennial. No, I'm
it's like you white, you Ben Affleck.
No, this is okay. But either way, I was like bugging Bhaskar, like, come on, let's do something. And then it wasn't until finally Michael was like, Bhaskar, come on, you guys gotta have a YouTube channel. And, and so then like Bhaskar's like, okay, fine. And I have this like guy, this cuss millennial that like really wants to produce it. So
they're bugging me for 2 years. Fine, we'll do it.
He claims he's your little brother. His name's something Brooks. I don't know. He's got a weird name, but
pretty much verbatim. But no, I mean, I owe all of this to Michael. So yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous amount of gratitude, and happy to continue doing it. So
same here.
Yeah, same. All right. That was one hell of a show. Thank you to everyone who's watching. Thank you to Kale for doing what he does every week, getting everything together for us so we can make our arguments and share our perspectives with you all. Please support Michael's work by going over to the TMBS Legacy Project Patreon page. Please become a patron. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, and also subscribe, if you haven't already, to the Jacobin magazine, because it's fantastic. Thank you guys for doing this with me. I can't think of anyone else that I would rather have these conversations with. So I'm really happy to be here with you guys. And everyone else, have an awesome weekend. We will see you soon with another episode of Weekends.
I should just mention, we're going to be off this upcoming week, but then we'll be back, and we have a very big guest. So watch reruns or whatever. This is, it's we'll be back. And good chance
to catch up to any episodes you guys missed. So
watch the old Michael ones. All right.
Yeah.
They're
better.
Yep. Right. No, stop being so self-deprecating, Nando. You're great. And anyway, love you guys. Have a great weekend. We'll see you soon.
Bye.